Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. So, hello everyone. My name is Seville. I'm a social planner at the region of Waterloo Municipality. I'm also the president of the Canadian Harper Society. I would like to welcome you all who are joining us from different parts of Ontario to the online workshop on direct and uncomfortable truths with Kween. This event is part of our Diverse Communities Thriving in Equity project. First, I want to acknowledge that the land on which I am today, it is a region of Waterloo. It is located on the Haldimand Tract land that was granted to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River and is within the territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. To kick off the event, I would like to give a very brief introduction about the organization. The Canadian Helper Society is a Canadian-based nonprofit organization in Waterloo region. It aims to empower individuals from diverse backgrounds and to advocate for marginalized and vulnerable groups in our local community. In particular, our projects are directed towards youth, elderly population, women, and low-income families. We aim to promote well-being and reduce barriers such as racial inequity in the society that impact quality of life. And we would like to acknowledge that our today's event is supported by Waterloo Region Community Foundation, on abbreviation WRCF. At this event, we are going to shift our focus from conversations around equity, diversity, and inclusion, something we discussed before, and look to a more intersectional lens that is direct, uncomfortable. This will explore how violence, oppression, and harm are constraints, harming BIPOC, it means Black, Indigenous, and other people of color communities, leaving benefits to the privileged groups, and how we work to be accomplices in the group towards racial justice. We also move into what Indigenous relationship building can look like as allies and settlers. And I would like to give an introduction to Kween. Kween is the CEO and owner of the Kween Company and co-owner of the Hills Academy. She graduated from the University of Guelph and she was the valedictorian of the Randolph Academy for Performing Arts. She's a dancer, teacher, actor, choreographer, director, producer, marketing guru, international speaker, advocate, and co-contributing actor to 100 Women of Inspiration and the Stage Lickers. Kween is the past executive director and social justice initiative coordinator for Guelph Black Heritage Society. Kween is also host and community producer on Rogers Channel 20 with Diverse and Converse, which is a BIPOC panel discussion. Kween is specialized in EDI, means equity, diversity, and inclusion work, especially for violence, oppression, harm, and Indigenous relationship building. Kween's achievements are truly long and inspirational. I'm going to name a few. So Kween held the residency with Guelph Dance in 2020-2021. She was a winner of Women of the Year 2020, nominee for RBC Women of Influence 2021, Women of Inspiration 2021 finalist, and nominee for RBC Canadian Entrepreneur Awards 2022, Women Who Rock Awards 2022, Reader's Choice 2023 Best Entertainment Company, Reader's Choice 2023 Best Professional Service, and winner of the Global Recognition Award 2023. And the wonderful fun fact is she was Miss Canada 2013 finalist. She was also the National Canadian Miss at Miss Guelph 2023, which is wonderful. Thank you so much, Kween, for being with us, and to you.
Thank you so much, Seville. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Shane, for coordinating everything, and to the Waterloo Region Community Foundation and Canadian Helpers. It is amazing to be here with y'all today on this, what I think is a gloomy morning here where I am. I would just love to see some sun. It was snowing here, and I'm just not okay with that in the middle of April. So I'm excited to just have bright, sunny faces. I will be having a slideshow up, so if you do feel more comfortable Keeping your video up, you're welcome to, but I will have slides up, so you're welcome to turn off if you're more comfortable and you want to eat breakfast and enjoy together. So today we will be looking a little bit at the violence, oppression, and harm. It will just be an introduction. We only have an hour together. We could talk for decades about this conversation. I'm just going to bring up the slides here and just let me know if this is working okay. Can everyone see that okay? You could just nod and that.
I think if you click on present full screen, I think it will, because we can still see other slides.
Here, let me just try this again.
Yeah.
This will work this time. Can you see the full screen?
It cannot really, like we can see the other slides also below. I'm not sure why is the
Screen sharing and pause. What does that mean?
Actually, we can see all the
slides like at the bottom, like 1, 2, 3
of the screen, but I believe that's okay. Yeah. Do you agree?
Oh, yeah, it should be a full screen. That's so weird.
Okay, it's good.
It should like fill the full screen. Just give me 1 sec here. So as I'm talking, thank you so much as I'm figuring this out here.
No problem.
Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction. I think that at the end of the day, what it really talks about is just an example of how much work can be done within our communities when we look at the Black and Indigenous communities that we're serving. Let me just see here. We're going to try one more thing for y'all. Is it? Is that full screen this time?
Yes, it is full screen. Yes, we are seeing about the now it's the first bit. Yes,
it only took a little bit. Sorry, y'all. Thank you for
wonderful.
that.
No, it's perfect.
And thank you so much for having me today. I today am on the lands of Tadina Done, which is known as Guelph, Ontario. And I'm very grateful as a Black settler to have the opportunities to talk about some of these things, not only as Black settler information, but when we talk about Indigenous allyship and what that can look like for us. So as we go on here, we did a great background about what I do, and I think that came from a place of wanting to encourage more conversations around the communities we're in. I also was in Toronto for a long time, and the atmosphere was a little bit different than what I feel in my hometown that is predominantly white. And so I wanted to have some more of these conversations around equity, diversity, and inclusion, which I hear you've talked about a little bit before on some past workshops. So that's amazing because it gives you a kind of good point to start from. So as we go along today, the goal is for the opportunity for us to engage and learn and unlearn how we can understand the facets of the way colonial practices have dictated so many ways that we reflect and the ways that we think. So, excuse me. What is EDI? And we'll give you a little bit of a lowdown because I think sometimes it can be confusing to understand what each of these things are. So equity is defined as a removal of systemic barriers and biases that enable all individuals to have equal opportunity to access. So equity is the process and equality would be the result. So to achieve this, it would mean that all individuals who participate would need opportunity to develop understanding or learning or growing, which is great because we have opportunities like university, college, trainings like this to expand our mind and have these conversations. Diversity is a demographic mix of community with a focus on representation on equity deserving groups. What does that mean? That's like defined as differences such as race, color, place of origin. This could also be something like religion, gender identity. And inclusion is the creation of an environment where everyone feels welcomed, where everyone feels safe, and where everyone is treated with respect and is able to fully participate in the conversations. Now, this doesn't always necessarily happen when we're looking at these issues. So we must unpack this, because what is equity really? It's the result of humanity giving space for all to have a perspective. But we talk about this in terms of like, what lens are we looking at? And when I say this, a lot of the kind of markers of Canadian politics or Canadian laws are built on what we call this colonial structure. So diversity can be this really cute word that can easily be thrown around, but there really should be no thing as equity deserving groups. Everyone should already be able to feel protected, should be able to feel safe, and should be able to be safe from any harm from such oppressors that maybe some of our BIPOC community feel. An environment such as inclusion, when we talk about that, that's supposed to be an environment where everyone is welcome. So therefore, it can be exclusive to whom? The word inclusion means that we're already exclusive to somebody. So the rationale behind these policies and practices is that we come together and that we have these great conversations, but what do they really mean? Because the problem with diversity and equity is rather than correcting injustices, they only reverse their flow when people think they can just do one EDI training and they know all the knowledge. So let's be really clear. This isn't about a people issue. This is really an economical, structural issue that can be worked on by the people. So while I'm not trying to dock equity, diversity, and inclusion, these are all really great things, I am encouraging us to look through a different navigation system, such as violence, oppression, and harm. We will have an end bit where we'll talk a little bit about Indigenous relationship building, that we'll talk about allyship, but I honestly believe that that type of work does take more than just an hour of training today. So as we go along, we're going to look at these topics of violence, oppression, and harm. And let's start off with violence. Violence is a structural issue, but it can be what we call a global phenomenon. It actually results in 1.6 million people's deaths each year. So that actually makes it the leading cause of deaths worldwide. So while no country is untouched by violence, many of us have different internal conflicts. And let me mention that violent deaths cannot be just attributed to war. That is not included in this 1.6 million. So having these conversations about violence, again, can be a larger scope, as I mentioned before, because it really does go into a lot of different areas. It could be health and justice systems. It could be social welfare systems. It could be sexual or psychological abuse. It could just be the economy of the community that you live in. So while we would need all year long to talk about violence as a whole, today I'm going to just dive right into what I call structural violence, which exists when certain groups, classes, genders, or nationalities have privileged access to goods or resources. So this can kind of look like social or political economical systems that govern our lives. So when we look at this type of violence, it requires us to look at both political and social change in order for us to look at the transformation that has happened. And that transformation is a really important part of this work because it allows us to see the hope that can also be part of the bravery that it takes to look at some of these existing and racist colonial structures. So this kind of leads me into a little bit about economical violence that I'll give you a little hint on. Because when it comes to economical violence, these issues are a matter of life and death when families have to choose between paying for their medicine or feeding their children, keeping a roof over your head, or having your basic health needs met. So while these are choices for all families, the racism that's been embedded within our economic and health systems means that families that are BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color, are more likely to face these barriers. So we must not only confront the violence targeting people of color, but we also must see these underlying racist structures to continue to navigate for those who are disadvantaged in the communities. As we move on, and feel free to keep any questions to the end, I will do my best to leave a little bit of time for everybody as well, if you have anything. But I can also talk forever, so I will warn you that I might also use up the time. Nevertheless, we'll keep going on, and thank you so much. And I hope everyone can hear me okay, and that the sound is still okay.
Yes, it's perfect. Yeah.
Beautiful. And as we go on, we're going to look at what oppression looks like. So oppression might be overt or covert, depending on how it is practiced. And oppression is malicious or an unjust treatment, or sometimes what we call the exercise of power, like the use of power in somebody's position under such governmental authority, for example. So we've had people marching in the streets, as you see there. We had a picture there that's actually from the 2020 protests in Guelph that happened here in Guelph, Ontario. I can't believe how long ago that was already. And we saw these kind of encouraging protests that were happening, and we are still seeing them right now when we look at other protests happening around our communities. And people had enough of the injustices that were happening around the world, because how many people were facing oppression? And that's not just yearly, that's on a one-time basis and everyday life for some people. We are demanding for police to be abolished. We are watching as many of the treacherous men that built some of these oppressive systems were being navigated out and being held responsible. We were yearning for better equal pay. We were asking for political change. And we needed people to really think thoughtfully and carefully, and also be willing to change their behavior. Because when we talk about Black and Indigenous people of color, we have to talk about the social and political climate that is oppressive. It does, oppression refers to discrimination when the injustice does not target and may not directly afflict everyone, but instead targets specific groups. And so unlike a history book, history itself doesn't have a clear endpoint. That means that we've made progress as a nation. We cannot look away from that. It's important to understand those points. And how I remember that myself is by saying the names of those who came before me, like Angela Davis, really, really big names who remind me of the work that we have done. But it doesn't mean that we still don't have work to do. Some of these racist structures that have happened have what we call kept the oppressed oppressed. It's just that simple. Systems like what we call Jim Crow, which gave way for mass incarceration, and for voter suppression, which allowed for oppression of Black Americans. We can also look at the early 2000s when banks steered Black and Latino borrowers to riskier and higher loans, which allowed the collapse of Black and Latino wealth. If we look at the way that the lingering effects of segregation have played an effect on education, job opportunities, health, when we look at the welfare system, or a criminal justice system that is punitive or terrible if you're Black, but able to find forgiveness and mercy if you are white. These are systems that were built by a government set up for us to fail. So we all need to be accountable in this work. It takes all of us. It takes all of us, including me. So when we look at these things that happen around us, people can be held accountable. When systems in their health systems like our health have been tied up in this notion of policies and practices not meant for us, we can hold people accountable for that. And while I could go on about oppression, it does have many streams. I'll give you a few just so you can understand. Institutional oppression, class oppression, gender oppression, racial oppression, and economic oppression. These are all just a few of the endless categories that can look under this. So oppression at the end of the day is when one opposes their will onto another and it somehow seems justified by the law. And that's how harm happens. And thank you all for the chats here. I do appreciate all that information. And thank you for catching up on that for the team. And as we move into harm, harm is a deliberate injury or damage to someone or something. It is a behavior that causes physical or psychological harm. And for example, that could look like harassment, intimidation, fear, alarm, distress. One of the important things as we go along that I want to point out is when we use these words, what I'm trying to do is remove some of the decriminalized and marginalized fear that kind of comes around EDI conversations. This fear that you might be called out rather than trying to call people into the conversation. It is really important to recognize that our Black populations and our Indigenous populations and other global majority populations are hugely a monolith. What that means is we have all different walks of life. I myself am not defined by my Blackness. I am also a cat mom. I'm a loving partner. I'm a daughter. I'm a sister. As you mentioned, the several things in my resume. And I think I pushed so much in my life to have those things on my resume because I wanted to be seen for more than what society kept defining me as, because it was harmful. And it showed up in the ways that we were treated in the medical system, in the educational system, in the work system, in the criminal justice system. Some of my experiences alone with doctors would be a horrifying story to unpack today. And just my experience with police, but having these conversations where we allow people to unpack the 100 years of unjust and racist policies and practices, allow us to live a life where we can breathe. It allows us opportunity for a better quality of education. It allows us that access to healthcare and that accountability we talked about. There has been a deep and multifaceted problem with the way our system has been built on our government, our health, and our economics. But we have been working so hard, especially since 2020, on how we undo, unlearn, unpractice, and relearn some of these new tools. So how does this affect our reality? How does this make us feel, or how does this allow us to be heard? And since 2020, we looked at the racial inequalities that were more and more brought to light, but it kind of left us back at what we looked at in the 80s, in the Jim Crow era. It left us back in 2002 when we looked at the Ronald Reagan era, when we brought into conversations of a civil rights movement. Or 2015, if we look right directly in our homes, and for someone like myself in Ontario, this also happened out in BC, where we engaged in community plans that looked at reducing systemic racism within our communities. But then here we were again at 2020, looking at these same additional issues when we are unpacking these things of racial inequalities. So what does that mean for us? How does it allow us to move forward? I introduced what we call the 3 B's of harm. This is allowing us to kind of take all this information and apply it. Balance. This is looking at the ways that we can decrease harm by looking at the balance of the experience for those less represented groups. For example, the rooms that we look in, the other day I was at a conference of 150 people of this community, and I was the only person that was Black in the room, and that was evident for me. And I think that allowed me to put some accountability into those in the room on where are we bringing the represented groups that we're talking about. because we were having conversations of diversity and equity, but nobody was in the room representing that. Barriers to entry, both structural and societal, that might be at play. So this might be looking at your workplace, for example. What are the ways that we are operating? Do we need to look and make more decisions about looking for specific people to include in our businesses? Blind spots and assumptions that might be working against a more inclusive environment. These are really important. I think for many of us here in this room, blind spots might not exist at such a huge level because we've been doing this work. But for some of us, it's also a good reminder to say, oh, this is maybe somebody else's experience. My grandmother always told me, may she rest in peace, she always told me, you never know what someone is going through, what they've gone through, or what they're about to go through. And this is where our blind spots sometimes come into play, when we forget to act with that compassion. And for hundreds of years, these unjust and racist policies have been a way that has impacted people in the way that they work, the way that they access healthcare, education, and even the way that they might walk in life. And this all affects our well-being. So we're going to dive a little bit into Indigenous relationship building. Excuse me. My allergies are so bad because the weather is so flip-flop in Ontario here. It is a nightmare. I'm ready for hot weather. And as we go into Indigenous relationship building, I do want to quickly just put out there that a part of this work with Indigenous relationship building has been in conversation with Indigenous friends of mine. And the reason that is that I believe that conversations, one, allow us to grow. And I believe that we also have to have an opportunity to engage together. And we'll go through that as we go through this process. And it's important to have these conversations as allies and the ways that we can show up for each other in different ways. So Indigenous relationship building is going to be the quality of your relationship with our Indigenous community. It will be measured by the effort invested and your integrity. How easy does that sound? That just means that it's your morals and integrity. That's so simple, but it's not all that simple. And while many of us do not abide by this, the goal here is that Indigenous research is research in any field and in any discipline. It doesn't need to just be coupled into this Indigenous research. It can actually be very grounded, and it's very important for us to engage with different communities, such as our First Nation, our Inuit, our Métis, or other Indigenous nations or societies. For example, when we look at Palestine, or when we look at Jamaica and some of our Indigenous people like the Tianos. It is important for us to have these conversations because we need to understand the cultures, the experiences, and the knowledge systems that exist within these communities, because it allows this emphasis of their values in the existing strengths and assets that already have existed that have just been pushed down by years of this colonial structure. So when we talk about this kind of settler colonialism, we're really describing the ways that colonization has had such a relationship on Canadian soils. When we think about the way the context of Canada, known as Turtle Island, when the British and the French engaged in the colonial project on these lands, in the context and discussions around internal colonialism, that can look like the welfare system, residential schools. It really describes the ways in which these structures have actually maintained in lives and subjected this population. So the foundation and the roots of this country are built on a system based on this, but we have the opportunity to really unpack and make these new relationships, build our society in a new way that is better for all BIPOC people. So with Indigenous relationship building, I'm going to try and break it down to you. There's 3 topics here: be trustworthy, be transparent, and be respectful. When we talk about trust, my grandmother also said this. I might have a few quotes from her. She was a wise woman. It takes years to build, seconds to break, and forever to repair. So in terms of trust with relationships in our Indigenous community, it is arguably the most important element. If looking at an Indigenous relationship from a perspective of resource development, for example, we have to keep in mind that there has been such a long history of broken promises in terms of environmental protection, employment, revenue sharing, and the community benefit. Just 20 minutes, 40 minutes away from me in different directions here, there are Indigenous lands without water access. So when we're looking at this perspective, it's a timeline of promises that dates back all the way to Confederation. So when we look at trust, we really need to adopt a mantra of promise less, deliver more. And I know it's easy for us to make all these promises and things, but it's important for us to deliver as well. You also need to be transparent. I like to say transparency is like the cousin of trust. It almost collides right in line with it, because allowing ourselves to be transparent, being open, allowing us to have those conversations, even if uncomfortable, allows the communications to be very clear from the start. So be transparent about your plans, and be transparent even if problems arise. Sometimes they do, and that's okay. It allows us to work through them together instead of not having the conversation. Number 3, be respectful. One sign of respect is thoroughly researching the community that you want to work with. And that's in any community, by the way. So if you're interested in working with a community, it shouldn't be just on them to teach you. It can be on you to learn some history, worldviews, governance structures, traditions, or cultures. You know what that means? It means that the community cares enough to put in the time to learn about you, to show up with resources and research. And you don't need to know it all. It's just showing that you're trying to make those steps. And let me tell you, the research is there and the education is there. So there is places that we can start from. And as we move on, we're going to go into a few more for you. Be invested. Now, I know this can be hard for us because we all have very busy lives, but it does take those time and resources to build those relationships with our Indigenous community. So that could mean visiting a land bank. That could mean donating to an Indigenous community. That could be helping with food drives. That could be supporting those on the front lines that you see here in the pictures that are doing the work to protect their lands. Be involved. If you have a partnership with a community, then you also need to be involved in the community. Exactly like what's happening here with this kind of melding of organizations. Your relationship is with the entire community, not just its economical structure. Support and attend events. You can celebrate with them. It isn't always actually about the heavy work. There can be joy in part of this work. And be patient. If you've done your research, as we mentioned, then you will know that most of these decisions are community-based. Chief and council can be busy with community concerns. They can be busy with events. Your project or your email could be potentially just another demand for them and could be just weighing on their time and their resources that they might not have for you. It's not anything on you. Just be patient. And as those things come along, they will come together. So thinking about being allies and accomplices in this work, I gave you a lot of information. It can be hard to figure out where to start to show up in this work. Where is my allyship? It doesn't have to be necessarily protesting on the streets. When we talk about thinking about this equity, diversity, and inclusion at the deeper level, it also means we get to address deeper questions. We need to stop appeasing necessarily this colonial structure. We actually need to reflect and continue on the work that we're doing. It's been so impactful and so powerful. We must differentiate between diversity, inclusion, and equity. And let's have those real conversations about violence, oppression, and harm. We also then need to look at those 3 B's of harm so that we can look in our professional organizations, in our schools, in our friend groups. And then that allows us to have the conversations and then put into programs or put into research. And if that all sounds a little too much, we can just start with a conversation. We can just start, we can start with the conversation. And to do this, we must accurately describe the ways in which, bring this down as we come together. We must accurately describe the ways in which we have universal similarities, the ways that we can unite each other. We also must look for the ways in history that we can fix and advocate for, and maybe the ways some people were left out in practice. I'm going to give you some tools today so that we can reflect and educate ourselves as well as speak up. When it comes to reflecting, I think an important goal for us is to accept the racism that may have happened within our societies. It's a first step. And I think that that's been really happening since 2020. Like, these conversations are happening. Y'all have been doing these amazing workshops. It allows us to reflect in the ways that systemic racism in our position has impacted you and impacted perspectives. The experiences of Black and Indigenous and other BIPOC groups can also vary. So we can't forget that everyone is a monolith. Like I said, we all come from all different intersectionalities. That means that we can all face violence, oppression, and harm in different ways. This also sets a solid foundation for us to continue the education. This doesn't stop. So we do, number 2, need to educate ourselves. To continue moving forward, continue educating yourselves. Don't stop educating yourselves. In fact, I think a lot of this work, what I've been hearing, particularly this year, is I've already done my EDI training. I'm good. But there are a lot of voices out there, and it doesn't need to be just an EDI. I think next week you have Rochelle Lavelle back in to do a workshop. And I think it's really important to continue these kind of workshops and experiences to indulge our knowledge, to educate ourselves in different facets that we might have not thought about. Maybe some of the areas that weren't coming up in our day-to-day lives. Just recently, I did a painting course and I couldn't believe what I learned. And I think that what it allowed me to see is this perspective that there's always people to learn from, not just me. I'm not the only one at the end of the day. This kind of laws that we talked about, this kind of education of violence, oppression, and harm. I want you to think about how the laws have changed. Are they still targeting groups? Are they still experiencing this today? And a great example is the welfare system. We may have had residential schools back in the day, and not that far back, like 1992 was the last residential school closing. So it's not that far back. I was born in that generation. So really having that understanding and knowledge that while we looked at the residential system, it just shifted itself to this kind of practice of the welfare system, keeping Indigenous and Black and brown bodies in a system that allowed government control. So allowing yourself to think about that, or maybe thinking to yourself, did I know those historical events such as the Jim Crow, such as the loan crash into the 2000s? That allows you to continue diving into other research that might exist out there. And you heard me today talk a lot about Canada. And I think for us, it also puts into example about Turtle Island, why we have these land acknowledgements. And thank you for doing that and introducing that at the start of this, because I think that that's important for us to continue, is acknowledging that the lands that we're on, even as settlers, it doesn't mean that you're to blame necessarily, but it does allow us that kind of truth and reconciliation that Indigenous people are talking about. And lastly, speaking up. I think this can look very different. Like I said, it's not always protest. This can be challenging yourself just to do the research, as we spoke about. This can look into your communities, even your family and your friend groups. This can be making baked goods and bringing water down to those who are protesting on the streets. It could be doing active work at home to make posters, to do education courses. We each have a very active role to play in working against violence, oppression, and harm, and finding ways that we can elevate historically and systemically left out groups. Education is very key to effectively defeating systemic racism. I believe that's key. Second, as my grandmother said, compassion. That's another part that's really key, is just showing up for each other, opening our hearts, listening, and allowing each other to get that information. I'm hoping it is possible. I have a few resource guides that I can include and some links that maybe can be posted later for folks to follow up on. Just some starting points, like an anti-racism guide, like a reading list that allows you to kind of find some areas that you can start with, whether that's newspaper articles, whether that's documentaries on Netflix. Maybe you want to sit down and watch something. Just some guides for you. Terminology resource. I think that that's really helpful as we go through this and as you continue some of these workshops and events, is to get the terminology that you can keep. We talked about some big words like just alone, equity, diversity, inclusion. That's a lot to remember. And then additionally adding everything I gave to you. So I will pass on that as well. I'm also going to encourage that you read an article that's called "There's No Racism in Canada, a Timeline." And it's a very interesting article to read. It does indulge in the racism in Canada, but it brings to point a really important issue that's that I think that y'all can take from. This I'm going to encourage even in the next month to do. It's not going to take you too long. I'll include that resource and link to that. So some other ways that you can do are big and small. You can help with by passing the Equality Act, by encouraging the federal government to get involved. We can act at our provincial level by protecting our BIPOC, trans, and non-binary siblings from the attacks that have been happening. We can act even at our local level, ensuring local public and private institutions are held accountable. That means talking to your city councilors. That means your MPs, your MPPs, your mayors, all those people. And I'll give you nice little templates and guidelines and resources that I can link to. So if you do want to make those letters and make those calls to action, it will give you a really good starting point. You can act at a personal level, talking to your friends, talking to your family, and talking to yourself, identifying maybe where your discrimination, your work might need to change, where you need to show up in allyship. We need to also look to those elected officials that I mentioned, keeping them accountable for our justice system, for our court system, our correctional system, our health system. And look to the leaders in your community. There are so many, what they say, influencers out there now that do a lot of this work, and community leaders that are really impacting the way that we work, whether that's grassroots organizations, nonprofits, or foundations like this who are coming together to do that work. There are a lot of informational guides and tools out there, and we need you. We need you to help advance this understanding of these issues. We need you to become the next justice officials. I'll be waiting. You let me know. We need you to be in high levels of administration. We want to see you as frontline workers, and we want to see you encouraged by this work, not feeling harmed by it. And again, that brings me to the last reminder, and that's just the compassion. Don't forget that in the work. I think for myself in 2020, I was so in the depths of grief and loss through what was happening through the Black Lives Matter movement that I was angry a lot. And that left me leaving in a place of forgetting where my compassion leads and how compassion and education can meet. I will leave a couple minutes here for questions if anyone has any. Yeah, and see if anyone has any, just in case, before I run out of time.
I have a question.
Yep.
Sometimes in workplace, something happening, and you don't know if it is based on racism or quality of your work.
Mm.
Even sometimes, as an employer, you are saying something because somebody doesn't show the quality, then if you tell the person something because of the quality of the job, then that person easily switch to racism. And this is ongoing problem because yeah, there is racism, but there is somebody is using this concept against their quality. They don't have to quality. They are not qualified for a position, then making trouble for everyone. That, oh, you said like this because I am something. This is an ongoing problem, as I have seen. Yes.
And that's a really good point. I think for me, what's really important in the workplace is to have an anti-oppression practice or policy. And why that is that allows that to come into a conversation so that I always like written documents. I'm a really like, needs to be on worded paper, not just conversation. And that allows you to look at both policies and practices to put in line. I think we have to be really careful about where we use systems against others and where we look at ourselves and take that internal practice to say, is it me? Is it maybe just me that I need to grow and work on? And then as the employer, like the other hand side of it, I think that it's important to have those practices and policies, such as an anti-racism policy in practice that can come up to avoid some of that. It allows you to go through that you've gone through all your policies and practice. This is completely in line with our other policies and practice, which might be your reliability, your time management, your organization skills, your X, Y, and Z. So for me, having those things in worded places is really important because it protects yourself and protects the employee on both sides.
And finally, who is the person getting decision? This is the problem is because of the racism or because of the quality? Who is going to get decision that which one is that?
I think at the end of the day, it has to really come down to the employer putting in their practices. I think those practices allow that if somebody wants to use it as racism, for example, can't come back to you because you have an anti-racism policy in practice. It came back to your policy perhaps around time management. So I think that having that additional policy might be beneficial for organizations, which is something that I actually implement with quite a few. And that's like from hospitals, we've implemented just recently an anti-oppression, anti-racism practice and policy, because it protects both the employee and the employer on both hands, depending on the situation.
Thank you.
And I can talk to you more about that too, if you need somewhere else to resource for that.
Thank you.
I have another question. So first of all, some really, really good points were raised, and I'm really grateful for them. Like to even start your presentation with the process of learning and unlearning, it was really useful to just keep educating ourselves and just not stick to the whatever like beliefs that we had or perspectives that we have. So it was really valuable. And the fact that you mentioned also the operation could be visible or hidden, and we are seeing the visible one, but we might be not aware of some hidden ones even around us. So it's really important. And it was a really nice thing to say. I think it was from your grandma, her rest in peace, that it's easy to destroy something than to build or rebuild. It's really like we can see it every single day. So my question was about equity and equality. So many people are confusing these two, equity and equality. Could you just like some address like that? What is equity? What is equality?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I briefly discussed what equity was, and that's probably my fault for not differentiating a little bit better between the two, because they one look like the same word and sound very similar. So while we look at equity and equality, as I said, they sound similar, but the implication of one versus the other can lead to a different outcome. So let me break that down a little bit more. So we talked about a little bit about equity on what that was. Let's talk about equality as well. Equality means each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunity. So that's to start off. Equality means that you're given the same resources and opportunities. Equity is recognizing that those persons or group of people have different circumstances or resources or opportunities that we still need to work on to reach that equal outcome. So when we work on equity, so looking at our circumstances or looking at those opportunities, it allows us to reach equality, looking at how individual groups or people have those same resources. Does that make sense? It's almost like the apple in the tree. Like
100%. Yeah, absolutely. So it means like when it comes to like equality, it means somehow we are ignoring the background and the situations that the targeted community is having or is carrying. Yeah, yeah. Just giving the same resources to everyone. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. Thank you for that question, because I think it is important to kind of understand like the difference. I feel like equality is having, yeah, like that opportunity that comes out of equity. So kind of using both in the same to address, using the same access system still, right? Like we're still talking about the inequities or the oppressive systems, but the route to achieving equity cannot be accomplished without equality, if that makes sense. It's kind of like a
person. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank
apple in the tree type of situation.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thank you.
Any other questions for folks? And if you feel uncomfortable coming off of mute, you're welcome to just put it in the chat. But any other questions before we wrap up? Oh, Dina, your sound isn't working.
Hello. I just wanted to add something.
Yes.
I am quite fascinated and overwhelmed that your organization is really existing, that you are really to help those who are in need and who are experiencing unjust treatment to others. And this is my last question. How are you going to address if someone or somebody are experiencing those kind of treatment?
Yeah, so
Thank
that's
you.
a great question. Thank you for that. One of the ways that the Kween company particularly is we're always an open book. I always say to people, I don't sleep much. You can DM me, we have a work line as well that people can reach out to. Additionally, our email, but we're also not everything. So what I mean by that is I'm not a housing system, so I can't find someone a house. I don't have that, but I do have the resources to connect to the right people. For example, if somebody needs food access, I might not be able to give them that, but I can give them the resource. If someone has a police interaction or an unjust interaction, there are lawyers, paralegals that we work with in our company. I'm not the lawyer, but I can definitely work with that lawyer to help someone. So I think it's what that means for me is how important partnerships are in our community, because we can't do it all. Canadian Helpers can't do it all. The Waterloo Community Foundation can't do it all. The city of Waterloo couldn't do it all, and I can't do it all. But finding each other and who can do what to show up, I find, is really important so that we can help support people. That additionally looks like networking, making those conversations, meeting new organizations and people, to ensure that we have the right connections for people to get the help that they need and the support. I'll always be there to help vent if you need a call, but I might not always be the main final answer if we need a further investigation or a further support tool. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much, Queen.
Thank
I also
you.
want to emphasize something. So it was a very nice state by one of our leaders in my team. It was saying that when equity is done right, it shouldn't be obvious. And it's such a nice say. It shows how much we have is still to work on it. Even when I'm doing the land acknowledgement, really most of the time I'm just thinking like, yeah, we are doing it just for the sake of just doing it. Not really, we're not like understanding every single word of it. So in my team, like we started working on like even for the land acknowledgement, how really we can customize it, like how the impact of like colonization or whatever, like the oppression that we experience in our home country or at the moment really is impacting our lives. And it's really like even at the region of Waterloo municipality where I'm working, like we keep talking about equity in our grant application and everything, but are we really addressing it or no? We are just doing it for the sake of doing it. We're carrying the budget for the next year. And it shows like how much more we need like to really understand how like the colonization and everything we have experienced like impacted our lives and how much more work it needs to be done in the society when it comes to learning, unlearning, when it comes to really practicing it. So it's still a long process. So we still need lots of work and hopefully we are going to be far from just doing things for the sake of just doing things. So yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's important that we, when it comes to land acknowledgements, I do what's called a unity address because I find it's very weird to acknowledge the land that we stole. That seems odd to me, to keep kind of putting that trauma onto Indigenous communities when we can reflect. So it is important for us when we hear a land acknowledgement being done, maybe take that moment to like close your eyes, internally ask yourself the way you want to show up for Indigenous communities, really just like take that in. As I said, there's a community 20 minutes from me that has no running water, no access to water still. When we look at Chemical Valley, that's in Sarnia, that again, no running water, a huge act of environmental racism that's left almost 80% of their community with cancer. Like we see these things actively happening, but we miss out on them and we just use it as a housekeeping tool. So encouraging yourself, that says the internal work, encouraging yourself to like just take that moment, really think about what you're going to do maybe that week or that month to just show up for someone, acting with that compassion, acting with that care on yourself as well. Like some of this work can be really heavy. So I do think it needs to meet with joy. That means celebrating communities. I love food. That's my way to show up, is like food, dance, and music. Like those are 3 amazing ways to celebrate different cultures and heritages. Do that too. Don't just like put yourself in this work and put all this like strain on yourself. You won't make it through. Also encourage that joy and celebration of the cultures and heritages we have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing them. Thank you.
Thank you. Amazing. Well, I see that we're at our time. It's been amazing. One, I sometimes come on these virtual calls and no one is on video and I see no beautiful faces. So this is a very appreciative for me to have kind of that connection, even if it's through the video. It allows my soul to also be filled when I'm giving it to people. I'm really grateful for my ancestors and my family who give me this opportunity for the work that we get to do. And the conversations that we get to have. It takes all of us, even me, everyday work. Keep showing up and have a beautiful Sunday.
Thank you so much, Queen. And thank you so much, everyone, for